Welcome to Paint Examinations. This is the final topic of Module 5. We will begin by defining paint and talking about the various components of paint. We will then discuss the various parts where paint evidence might be found and the value that it can bring to an investigation. We will discuss the various tests that are performed on a paint sample in a forensic laboratory so that you can recognize the difference between automotive and structural paints. We will finally discuss the collection and packaging of paint samples. Paint may be found in a lot of different forms in criminal investigations. You can see from this it can be that it's vehicular paint from traffic accidents. It might be structural paint from burglaries or robberies where breaking and entering takes into account. Or it might be something just as simple as nail polish or spray paint. So exactly what is paint? Paint is going to be defined as a liquid mixture that's used as some type of decorative or protective coating. It's going to always contain solid pigment, extenders and or exclusions that are going to be suspended in a type of a binder that's going to be adjusted with a dryer or a solvent in a liquid vehicle. This is all going to be used for your decorative or protective coatings. The pigment is going to provide the color to the paint itself. Extenders or exclusions may provide a little bit of substance to the paint sample itself, being things like your metallic flakes. The binder or the vehicle is the liquid portion that's going to hold all of the components together. And then in addition to this, there's always going to be dryers or solvents that are going to be used to give that correct liquid consistency to the paint sample itself, and also the ability for that paint to dry into a film. If we think about the different types of paints that can be encountered by a forensic scientist, the first and the most common is probably different types of vehicular paint. This could be either from automotives, it could also be from boats, it could be from motorcycles, bicycles, any type of vehicular type paint. They'll also deal with different types of structural type paint. So in many instances, there's a lot of portions of different buildings or structures that have painted components, whether it be doors, window sills. It could also be stairway railings, different pieces of furniture. All of these types of paints are going to be considered architectural or structural type paints. There's a lot of different things that will also have different coatings on them. So this could be something as simple as fingernail polish, or it might be various appliances that have paint on them, different tools that have paint on them. And then finally, a lot of spray paint is also encountered in a forensic laboratory. This might be from items that have been painted, or it might be items that have been sprayed, as in graffiti. So once again, the paint samples are going to be used to establish associations between things. They can establish contact between two vehicles, or it can establish contact between a vehicle or an object and an individual, or in some instances it can establish contact at a specific scene, either with that object or an individual. And once again, there's a lot that can be learned from paint samples, depending on the size of the sample itself. So a paint is going to be analyzed for its physical and its chemical properties. Usually the first thing that the analyst is going to do is see if they might be able to obtain a physical match. In some instances, the paint samples might be large enough to do this, so they would work to determine if those pieces were won at an earlier time. However, in a lot of instances, the paint samples are going to be a little bit smaller, so they might not be able to work with the edges or the patterns or that overall construction to give the physical match. In situations like this, they will go on and try to determine the type of paint and then also to determine a lot of the properties for that paint itself. If there is not a known sample for comparison, if it is an original finish automotive type paint, there is a database that can help search to try to attempt to identify a possible make, model, and year that that paint had actually been used on. So exactly how do you go about determining if it is an automotive paint or if it's a structural paint or if it could be similar to your spray paints? We take into consideration the overall layer structure and the texture of those layers to try to determine if it is automotive or structural paint. For most automotive paints, they're going to have extremely thin layers and they're going to be very, very consistent in the width of those layers. Automotive paint is going to have either one or two primer layers, and at times might be slightly textured on the back of that primer layer. With structural type paints, the layers are going to be a lot thicker, and for the most part they're going to be very uneven because usually these are going to be applied with a brush, so you don't have that same consistency as what would be done in an automotive manufacturing plant. There also may be visible areas where dirt is actually caught between the various layers of paint. If an analyst determines that a paint sample is an automotive paint, they can also look closer at it to try to determine if it is an original equipment manufacturer paint sample or if it's a repaint. Usually your OEMs, or original equipment manufactured paints, will have 3 or 4 layers. This might be composed of a couple of base layers or an electric coat primer and a regular primer, then a color coat, and usually a clear coat nowadays. The electric coat primers are usually going to be epoxy based. Your primers are either going to be epoxy modified polyesters or urethanes, and typically your color coats and your clear coats are going to be acrylic based. But chemical tests can be performed on instruments to actually determine these chemical components of the paint samples. Repaints may still have the OEM paint layers within the paint structure, but usually there's going to be additional layers on top of the OEM layers. And there might also be the addition of Bondo or filler. You can see in the photo that's on this slide, it has the original OEM layers, but then a large area of Bondo before additional paint layers were applied. The analyst is also going to work to determine the different physical and chemical properties of that paint sample, and then usually they're going to be comparing it to known samples that have been submitted. So if we think about the various physical properties for a paint sample, of course the overall color of that sample is going to be extremely important. The color would be taken into consideration for every layer of that paint sample. The top layer may have a lot of weathering to the sample itself, or it may have specific surface details which might need to be noted. The specific layer structure is very important, including the texture or the thickness of the various layers. The appearance of the pigment itself, whether it's a flat type paint or a glossy type paint, and then also, of course, if there are any inclusions in the paint sample itself, if it contains any metallic flakes. The chemical properties that are tested for a paint sample include the solubility testing and then specific instrumental testing for the various paint components. Usually with the solubility testing, a series of 3 or 4 solvents are used to immerse the paint chips in these solvents to determine if they might be soluble in one or more of the solvents. This helps give the analyst an idea as to the type of paint or the binder that may have been used for that paint sample. Also, some of the instrumental techniques that can be performed on paint samples will give that analyst a lot of information about the paint components. The elemental analysis of paint samples is usually performed on an SEM, and it will give the analyst a lot of information about the specific pigments in the paint itself, so the portion that's going to give that paint the color. The gas chromatograph with the pyrolysis attachment allows the analyst to obtain a chromatogram from that solid sample, and this is also going to give them a lot of information about the various components of the paint. It will give them some information about the binder and then any other additives that might be in that paint, such as the various dryers or solvents in that paint sample. The micro FTIR will give the analyst a lot of information specifically about the binder of the paint itself, but then in some instances it may also give them some indication as to any extenders that are used in that paint chip. The microspectrophotometer will give the analyst a lot of information about the color of the paint itself, doing testings in the visible region, and then also a lot of the clear layers that are applied to automotive paints will give information in that ultraviolet region when using the microspectrophotometer. Paint evidence can be recovered from a wide variety of different types of crime scenes, and usually it's going to be detected with just a good visual search with nice bright light. At times it might also be recovered in the laboratory using either oblique lighting or, in some instances, the lighting with additional magnification. When collecting paint samples, you always need to remember to collect, if possible, known samples and then also your foreign paint samples. You want to use a scalpel to collect both of these samples off of any rigid surfaces. With the foreign samples, you want to try to collect, obviously, just the foreign paint if possible. When you collect your known samples, you want to make sure that you take the layer structure all the way down to the metal or to the plastic. Foreign paint samples are usually collected using either the scalpels or tweezers, but they might also be retrieved in some instances by scraping down items, taping items, or vacuuming. Remember, it's also important to, if possible, always get that known reference sample. You want to take your samples as close to the point of impact as possible, but not directly in it, because this is where your foreign paint would be located. And you want to separate these two items for the analyst. Remember, once again, with picking your samples with tweezers, you get the specific location of your item. A lot of times, scraping is a technique that is used in paint collections. This is done in a lot of instances if it's involving clothing. So in the pedestrian type accidents, hit and runs, you might be examining the clothing to try to locate small paint chips that might be able to be associated with a make, model, and of a vehicle for the suspect vehicle itself. In some instances, the foreign paints might be extremely fragile, or it might be harder to get these samples off without the possibility of losing the paint chip. So at times, taping the paint samples might help in the collection, but once again, you have to deal with the adhesive, and at times this is hard, getting small paint chips away from various adhesives. Vacuuming can also possibly damage your chips, and also it may be a little bit more efficient than what you would prefer for your sample collection. Once again, you always want to make sure that you're using appropriate containers. In a lot of instances, your paint samples are going to be extremely small. So usually label stick cans, which are very small metal cans, are used, or in some instances Ziploc bags. You have to be very careful with paint chips, because if you use paper bags or envelopes, it's very easy for those small chips to work their way out of the openings that can be left in paper bags and envelopes. If you think that your paint chips are on something that's wet, keep in mind again to always make sure that that item has the ability to dry. And once again, if you're not going to collect your paint chips, if you're going to send them back to the laboratory so that they can be removed with the aid of a stereo microscope, then you want to make sure that you protect that damaged area so that you don't lose any foreign chips that might be available for examination. Once again, always remember to label your evidence sufficiently and seal it sufficiently with tape and initials across the seal. If the paint chips that are obtained from, let's say, a case where there isn't a suspect vehicle, the paint data query can be used. This database is maintained by the FBI and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It is continuing to add newer samples into the database. This database takes advantage of a lot of the different chemical and optical properties of a paint sample. So if you have a foreign paint sample and you know that it is an original finish, the testings can be performed and then entered into the database to see if there is a sample that's. This can be extremely valuable in identifying possible make, model, and year of vehicles when that vehicle is not known.
The paint examinations and comparisons have been accepted in courts for years.
the analyst will reach several different results. If the paint sections are large enough and a physical match is obtained, they can say that that paint section and the additional paint section were one piece in an earlier time. Or in some instances, they may have to say that they could not be physically associated. When instrumental and microscopic comparisons are performed, the analyst can usually reach one of two results. Either that the paints are identical or similar to a known paint in the color, type, layer structure, and elemental composition, or that the paint sample was different than the known sample. In cases where the analyst may not be able to do complete testing, they may choose to use the wording similar instead of identical, or in some instances, the paint samples may be insufficient so that the analysis cannot be reached. This concludes the